Good morning, Houston. This is Rick Davis.
This is Aaron Edwards.
And you're listening to The Things That Matter Most, a show where we talk about things that everyone is passionate about, but that matter a whole lot more than sports or politics. Yes, it's Sunday, and yes, we're talking about God, but this isn't Sunday school. Each week, we bring you a different spiritual perspective or a hot topic. Our guest may be an atheist or a Hindu, or we may talk about a controversy or a movie with spiritual meaning. But our purpose is always the same, to help you, our listeners, to decide for yourself what you think is true and what is not about the most important questions of life. And Aaron, I'd like to welcome you again to our show. You've done several shows with me now.
Yes, I'm enjoying it very much. Thanks for having me.
Okay, well, it's great to have you. We missed Lael this week, but she will be back. And once again, I think we have a really interesting show today. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about what we're going to cover?
Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting show. Today, we're actually going to be initiating a conversation between Howard Storm and Hemant Mehta. Now, we've interviewed both of them individually on our show. And for those of you who didn't get a chance to listen to their respective interviews, you can do that by going to www.thethingsthatmattermost.org. But just to catch you up, Hemant is an atheist, and actually he is a guy that actually auctioned off his atheistic point of view on eBay to a nonprofit Christian organization called Off the Map. And the criteria was actually that for every $10 of the final bid, he would attend 1 hour of a Christian church service and write about it on his blog, which he did, and it ended up getting a lot of national attention. And then Howard Storm is a man who wrote a book called My Descent into Death, and he was a devout atheist himself, and then he had a near-death experience in which he claims to have been basically on his way to hell. And then after a change in the course of events, he was actually on his way to heaven, and we'll learn more of the details because he's going to summarize what happened. But actually, on our interview, I personally love what both of them had to say, so now we want them to meet and converse with each other, and then we can see what transpires.
Okay, so here's basically the idea of the show. We have two guys, both of whom we've interviewed before, who share and if you want to call it this, an atheistic past, right? Howard was an atheist. Hemant was an atheist.
And he still is.
And still is. And so they share an atheistic past. Their difference is that Howard had this experience that really ended up being kind of a conversion experience, where today he considers himself a Christian, and Hemant has not had such an experience and still holds to his atheistic views today. So really what we're going to try to do is stimulate a dialogue between these two guys on the air and let our listening audience listen in.
Right. And, you know, Hemant, I really enjoy interviewing Hemant because he's just really a genuinely upbeat, nice kind of guy. I guess his website says it all, friendlyatheist.com. And this guy really is smart, and he doesn't seem to ever really get on the offensive too much, like he's getting back into a corner. And when you read his blogs, you can sense kind of an honest objectiveness that is hard to find. I mean, when I put myself in his shoes, I believe that I would be hard-pressed to stay objective of so many different belief systems that I personally don't believe. And although he hasn't changed his opinion about his belief in God, I think that he is at least as open to the truth as he was when he first started this journey, and he's still on it. So.
And you know, as far as Howard goes, did you know that I went up to Cincinnati and actually saw Howard?
I did?
Yeah, well, you know, if you listen to the end of that show, the last show that you can find on thethingsthatmattermost.org, I actually sort of snapped that he was living in Cincinnati. I was getting ready to go on a trip with my mom, actually, to go see some family friends, and I went and visited with Howard when I was up there. So I found him to be a pretty low-key guy, and I think you can pick that up in the interview. He doesn't sound like he really has anything to sell.
Right.
He's just talking about really what he believes happened to him. And
nice, what happened.
I found it to be very persuasive.
Great. Just to give a bio on both of them, Howard Storm was a professor of art for 20 years at Northern Kentucky University, and in 1985, following his near-death experience in Paris, his life was transformed. He became an ordained minister and currently pastors a church in Kentucky. He later wrote a book documenting his near-death experience called My Descent into Death. Howard has shared his experience over the years to various media, including the Oprah Winfrey Show, 48 Hours, and the Discovery Channel. Hemant Mehta is a graduate of the University of Illinois in Chicago. While there, he helped establish their first group for non-religious people called Students Without Religious Dogma, or SWORD. He is the 2006 recipient of the American Atheist Life Membership Scholarship, and is currently working on a master's in education from DePaul University. Hemant blogs about his experience as an atheist on www.friendlyatheist.com, and you can also read him on www.offthemat.com.
Well, Howard, it's great to talk to you again, and welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's really nice to be back with you.
Hemant, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you again for having me.
Okay. Well, guys, what I would like to do for our audience here is to give them a good view of what's going to be happening on the show today. And so I'm going to run through this a little bit. And, again, this is for you, but this is largely for our audience. Okay. The way we're going to begin this is that we are going to let Howard tell his story. He, as you may recall, if you heard the intro to our show, you know that Howard had what I guess would be called the near-death experience, where there was actually a hell part of his experience, but also a heaven part of the experience. In order to set the stage for our show, we're going to begin today by having Howard actually go quickly through that experience. And this is for the purpose of refamiliarizing our audience with your story, Howard, just in case they did not hear the interview that we did for you before. And now, Hemant, in the retelling of his story, Howard will claim that this was a real experience. It was not a hallucination, but it was what it appeared to be, an encounter with God. And so once you and we and our listeners have all heard Howard's story, the rest of the discussion really will be a guided dialogue between you, Hemant, and Howard. What we want you to do, Hemant, is to respond to the various parts of the story that Howard is pointing to as evidence that it was an objectively true and valid experience. And we'd like our audience to not only hear Howard's point of view, but yours as well, which presumably will be somewhat skeptical. Now, I suspect that you, Hemant, will not easily accept that Howard's experience was what he thought it was, so we're interested in your skeptical critique and Howard's responses to your skepticism. We're not expecting, Howard and Hemant, that by the end of our discussion that we'll end up with both parties disagreeing, but we'd like our audience to hear the dialogue so they can decide for themselves if they believe that Howard had an objectively true and valid experience. Okay. So, Howard, what I'd like you to do now for about the next 10 minutes is to basically tell us your story, which I know you've done so many times.
Right. Okay, I'll give you the sort of quick snapshot version of it and try and keep my emotions in check, which tend to slow it down when I get caught up in it, because it's very easy for me to get caught up in it.
Of course.
This happened when I was 38 years old, June 1st, 1985, so a little over 20 years ago. And I was taking a group of students around Europe on an art tour. I was an art professor at Northern Kentucky University at the time. And on that Saturday, June 1st, 85, I had a perforation of the small stomach at 11 o'clock in the morning, and was I didn't know what it was. It just knocked me to the ground screaming and yelling with the most acute pain I'd ever had in my life. And a doctor was brought to the hotel, and he called an ambulance, and they took me to a hospital, and I was examined in emergency by a couple doctors and x-rayed and everything, and sent over to a surgical hospital. But unfortunately, because it was a Saturday, there was no surgeon available at that time to do the surgery, so I was parked for 10 hours and given no further medical attention whatsoever. The doctors in the United States months later, when I came home and was recovering from all this, told me that my life expectancy was about 5 hours, and that the situation's similar to having a burst appendix. And if you get to it within a few hours, excellent chance of recovery, but if it goes too long, you're probably going to die from it. So the fact that I survived 10 hours of this is miraculous, that I'm alive today to even tell the story. So I don't really have to defend myself on how close to death I was, because I was there.